In the first episode in this series, we discussed the basic definition of the term justice, as well as some distinctions that occur within discussions of justice. We also introduced Michael Sandel's categorizations of different approaches to justice. In this episode, we're going to take a closer look at utilitarianism, which ties justice to the notion of maximizing welfare. Let's get started. In its most basic form, utilitarianism maintains that something is right if it produces the best outcome, in terms of increasing benefit and decreasing harm, for the greatest number of individuals who matter morally, including yourself. Like most basic definitions, this one raises a lot of questions. For instance, what do we measure the outcome of? Individual acts? Principles? Rules? Laws? What counts as a benefit and what counts as a harm? How do we convert different types of harms and benefits to a common currency? Which individuals matter morally? What about prenatal life? What about non-human animals? We'll address some of these questions in a bit, but for now, let's take a brief historical look at the development of utilitarianism. There are two names that always come up when discussing the historical development of utilitarianism: Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. No, Carl, John Stewart is the comedian who hosted The Daily Show. John Stuart Mill is a philosopher from 200 years ago. Yes, Carl, I missed The Daily Show too. Jeremy Bentham lived in the 18th and early 19th centuries, and he's considered to be the father of utilitarian thought. Bentham's form of utilitarianism revolved around his principle of utility, which basically means that actions or policies should be judged based on whether or not they produce the greatest happiness for the greatest amount of people. For Bentham, happiness means maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain. And in Bentham's eyes, this way of measuring right and wrong was the only sensible way to approach ethics and justice. John Stuart Mill, who lived in the 19th century, developed Bentham's principle of utility more thoroughly. He did so by exploring what it means to flourish as a human being. Mill argues that for human beings to flourish, they need the space to be able to pursue the goods that are most appropriate to their nature. Now, of course, like other animals, humans can experience pleasure and pain, and Mill is adamant that maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain is important. But consider this quote from Mill: "It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied." Why does Mill say this? It's because in his view, human beings have unique attributes that make them capable of experiencing unique kinds of pleasure and pain. For example, Mill maintains that humans have liberty, the ability to act freely. He also maintains that humans have unique mental capabilities. Because humans have such unique capabilities, to be able to live a full human life, humans need to be able to act in ways that maximize the development of these unique capabilities. Mill's development of Bentham's views allows him to do two important things. First, he emphasizes the importance of liberty, which allows him to affirm the idea of natural human rights, an idea that Bentham rejected. In short, humans have a right to liberty. Second, it allows him to argue that some benefits, those that are more appropriate to humanity's unique capabilities, are better for humans than the benefits that are more befitting to lower creatures. For example, a pig may enjoy rolling in the mud more than listening to poetry, but humans have unique capabilities that allow us to appreciate poetry in ways that maybe pigs can't. And so poetry better reflects human flourishing than rolling in the mud. This brief historical overview highlights that utilitarianism approaches justice by suggesting that certain creatures, by virtue of their capacity to experience happiness, are owed consideration when considering the outcomes of actions, laws, or policies. And the way that the outcomes of these actions, laws, or policies affect these creatures has some bearing on whether or not those actions, laws, or policies are just or right. Let's take a few moments here and consider some common criticisms of utilitarianism. Sandel raises two, particularly directed at Bentham. First, utilitarianism really doesn't have any room for the notion of inviolable rights, so it could theoretically justify all sorts of harms to individuals, including torture. Sandel uses a particularly pressing example where torturing the innocent child of a terrorist might lead the terrorist to tell you where a bomb he planted is. So torturing this innocent child could save thousands of lives. It seems like applying Bentham's principle of utility here would suggest that we ought to torture the child, since so many lives will be saved. That is, torturing the innocent child is the right thing to do. But that's troubling to a lot of people. By the way, if it's not troubling to you, you definitely need to watch more videos on ethics and justice. Mill attempts to address this first criticism by emphasizing the importance of human liberty. But it's unclear that Mill's emphasis on liberty makes human rights inviolable. It seems that, at least in theory, if enough benefits were gained from depriving an individual or a certain group of their liberties, it would be the right thing to do to deprive them of those liberties. In other words, it seems theoretically possible that depriving some people of liberty might be a just thing to do. Second, it's unclear how Bentham's utilitarianism can measure different goods and harms on a common scale. Sandel addresses this question by asking how much money a human life is worth. Or, more to the point, can a monetary value be placed on human life? As you think about this question, think about the money that societies invest in things like art museums and sports arenas. This money could go to saving human lives. But it doesn't. And most people don't seem overly upset about this. And this raises an interesting question. How do we compare the value of things like art and athletics to individual human lives? We might add a few criticisms and questions to those raised by Sandel. First, should we measure the outcome of individual acts, or more generally, rules and policies? To highlight this issue, let's take a look at organ donation. According to the Health Resources and Service Administration, about 17 people die every day waiting for an organ donation. Most of them need kidneys. Now, humans happen to have a spare kidney. Let's imagine a scenario where we allowed humans to sell their spare kidney to others who needed it. It's possible to imagine that at least in some individual scenarios, this could maximize happiness for everyone involved. The organ donor receives money. The organ recipient gets to live. In these individual cases, it seems like the principle of utility would suggest that allowing people to sell their kidneys is a good thing. But what happens when we look at the policies underlying these individual acts? It's not hard to imagine that a policy that allowed people to sell their kidneys could easily lead to abuse. People being forced to give their kidneys, poor people feeling like they have to sell their kidneys because they don't have other options. The point here is that in certain cases, individual acts might maximize happiness, but the policies upon which those acts are built might not maximize happiness. Which one should take priority? Another question is how to evaluate consequences. Which consequences matter? If we focus on the intended consequences, it's possible that we could end up justifying actions or policies that lead to horrible consequences just because the people who perform the actions or put together the policies had good intentions. That seems problematic. But if we focus on the actual outcomes of actions or policies, we might end up justifying terrible actions or policies just because they happen to produce good outcomes. Or we risk condemning what appear to be good actions or policies simply because by some turn of chance, they produce negative outcomes. This also seems problematic. We might respond to this dilemma fairly easily by saying the consequences that matter are not the intended consequences nor the actual consequences, but the most probable consequences. But this raises another question. Who is entrusted to decide what the probable consequences are? And moreover, who is entrusted to decide how to measure these consequences? It's not difficult to imagine that European colonizers believed they were maximizing happiness by colonizing indigenous lands. Of course, if you ask the indigenous people what they think about the colonizers, they would likely say that they're not in fact maximizing happiness. The difference of evaluation of the outcomes is in part due to a different perspective, but it also might be due to a completely different worldview. So whose worldview is correct? At any rate, it seems that one danger of utilitarianism is the people that get to decide the probable outcomes, and the people who get to measure whether or not these outcomes maximize happiness, are probably going to be the people in power. And that can easily lend itself to abuses. Having considered some negative aspects of utilitarianism, let's turn now to consider some positive aspects, or at least some challenging aspects of it. First, utilitarianism actually takes consequences seriously. There are going to be some other approaches to justice that struggle to do this, but it seems almost intuitive that consequences do matter. They might not be all that matter, but they do matter. Aren't there some situations in which you consider the outcomes of actions or policies to have some bearing on whether or not those actions or policies are moral? Consider the example of lying. If you had the opportunity to lie to save a human life, wouldn't you do it? You probably would, and you probably would do it because you believe that the outcome of saving a human life outweighs any harm done in telling a lie. Consequences matter. Second, utilitarianism attempts to take away biases in evaluating morality. For utilitarianism, you are bound to count all creatures who matter morally when making your decisions, and you're bound to count them all equally, at least provided that they have equal capabilities. To the point, if you would torture an innocent child to save thousands of people, it shouldn't matter whether that innocent child is a stranger, a child that you know, or even your own child. In utilitarianism, you are not permitted to make an exception of yourself. You have to count others equally to how you count yourself. Depending on how we parse it, taking away this bias can lead to extremely challenging outcomes for us. For example, imagine that you won $1 million after taxes. What should you do with that money? Should you save it? Should you invest it? Should you spend it on yourself and your family? Or should you help others who are in need? Maybe you should do all of these things. But how do you decide how much to allocate to each expense? Well, here's an interesting question. Is anyone else due the money that you have won? From a utilitarian perspective, the answer might be yes. I say might be because Bentham and Mill tended to focus on legislative policies more than individual actions. However, the principle of utility seems to apply very clearly to individual actions. And if the principle of utility is true, it seems that individual actions should be measured morally based on whether they maximize happiness or not. Now, about that $1 million, ask yourself, do you really need all of that money to survive or even flourish as a human being? Given that billions of people survive and flourish without that much money, it doesn't seem like you need it. After all, if we're counting all lives equally, it seems that you should spend that money on relieving the suffering of others before you spend it on luxurious items for yourself. Today, perhaps the most influential utilitarian philosopher, Peter Singer, argues that we should spend as much possible money as we can on helping others, and that we should spend it intelligently. This approach to justice is called effective altruism. So, let's say you want to use $100,000 of your money to buy an extremely extravagant car. Singer suggests that you could buy a less extravagant car, say for $30,000, and use that $70,000 to maximize happiness for others. By the way, if you're wondering how much good you can do with $70,000, there are really good websites, well, really guilt-inducing websites, that can help you calculate that. Two worth mentioning are www.thelifeyoucansave.org and www.givewell.org. The first website is actually based on Peter Singer's book, The Life You Can Save. Now, as we're thinking about these questions, consider this. The organization GiveWell engages in rigorous evaluations of charities, researching how much good, in terms of lives saved or improved, a charity can accomplish with every dollar given. This research includes close examination not just of how the money is spent to help others, but how money is spent in terms of covering overhead costs for charities. GiveWell states that their highest rated charities, that is the most effective charities, can save a human life for somewhere between $3,000 and $5,000. That means that your $70,000 could save somewhere between 14 and 23 lives. Of course, you could also buy a car for $20,000 and use that extra $10,000 to save another 2 to 3 lives. And what about the rest of your $1 million? If you kept $50,000 for yourself and intelligently donated the remaining $950,000 to charities, you could save somewhere between 190 and 316 human lives. We could push this idea further by asking how much you ought to give of your annual salary. This is, of course, a very personal choice. And to be clear, we tend to think of justice as that which we are obligated to do, and charity as that which we maybe ought to do, but it's optional for us. But there's a legitimate question of justice in how individuals spend their money. Again, because utilitarianism requires you to count all lives equally, wouldn't it follow that justice would demand that you use your money to lessen the suffering of others before you use it to buy luxurious items for yourself? As you think about this question, consider that in his critique of utilitarianism, Sandel notes the public outcry that happened when certain companies placed a monetary value on human life. Now, in some of these cases, the issue was a callous disregard for human life, but there seems to be reservations about putting a monetary value on human life in general. The monetary value ranged from $200,000 to a few $1 million. So what do you think? Is a human life worth $200,000? Is it worth a few $1 million? How do we decide this? If you find yourself feeling squeamish about these numbers, consider the oddity that most of us spend money on luxurious items that we don't need, rather than using that money to save human lives at the rather cheap cost of $3,000 to $5,000 per person. If we're so upset at the idea that a human life might only be worth $200,000, how can we justify not spending $3,000 to $5,000 to save a human life? The point that I'm trying to make here is that critics of utilitarianism often focus on the negative possibilities of the approach to justice. These negative possibilities include justifying torture or slavery or harsh medical experiments without consent. But the other side of these negative possibilities are stark positive possibilities of utilitarianism. Imagine what the world would look like if every human being spent even half of the money that they spent on luxurious items, and instead gave that money intelligently to save other human lives. Of course, utilitarians like Mill would argue that you can't be forced to spend your money in this way. That's part of the importance of liberty. But just because Mill argues that you shouldn't be forced to spend your money this way, doesn't mean that you're not obligated by justice to spend your money this way. Just because you have the freedom to make a choice, doesn't mean that every choice you make is good or right. As we consider the idea of whether or not spending our money on luxurious items is just or not, consider this admittedly rather unlikely scenario. Imagine you were placed before a group of children dying of preventable or treatable diseases, and you were surrounded by all the luxurious items that you have purchased that you don't need. In the presence of those children, would you really be able to stand tall and say, I was just in purchasing these items rather than saving your lives? In this episode, we defined utilitarianism and provided a brief historical sketch of its development. We also looked at some common criticisms of utilitarianism, as well as some positive and challenging aspects of it. In our next episode, we're going to push Mill's focus on liberty a bit further by focusing on one approach to justice that emphasizes the importance of freedom: libertarianism. Until then, farewell.